So good morning or good afternoon, depending from which part of the world you are calling. My name is Marco Bastel. I am the director of the Center for Supply Chain Management here at Marquette University. And I would like to welcome all of you at our 2022 Supply Chain Symposium, which is a three-part virtual series focused on the topic of designing resilient supply chains for the future. So we have very exciting keynote speaker today, but before we proceed over there, a couple of short remarks. First of all, this seminar has been organized by the Center for Supply Chain Management here at Marquette University, which is also the home of two elite supply chain management programs, both undergraduate and graduate. We are ranked by Gartner at the moment as the 12th for undergraduate and 15th as a graduate program, and as number 16 by the US News among the best supply chain undergraduate programs here in the United States among roughly 220 universities. So I would also like to thank to our sponsors, particularly our platinum sponsors, Uline, Direct Supply, Milwaukee Tools, and I would also like to thank our gold sponsors, Redwood Logistics, GE Healthcare, our silver sponsors, Kohler, and our blue sponsors, Plexus and UPS, who all collectively together help us to put this series of webinars together with their support. So today's session, is our part one, and it's actually titled, We're in this together, Supply Chain Risk Management and Why We Should All Pay Attention. And it is my distinct pleasure to be able to introduce you to Mr. Sumit Vakil. He's a Chief Product Officer and co-founder of company Resilinc. As a CPO, Sumit is responsible for Resilinc product and technology vision, direction, and delivery. Sumit has over 25 years of experience bringing innovative technologies to market and has served in leadership roles in product management and engineering at successful startups, as well as at Fortune 500 companies such as Brocade and Cisco. So this webinar is set up in a way that it allows for the audience to post questions in a Q&A box. So please feel free to ask any questions and we'll answer some of them at the end of this session. And now over to you, Sumit, and when you are ready with your screen sharing, I'll ask you the first question. So thank you.
Okay. All right, I am ready to go. Yep. Did my screen show yet? No? Okay, let's try that again. Okay.
Yep.
All right.
Sumit, before we dive deeper into supply chain risk management, could you please tell us briefly about the Resilinc and its business?
Thank you, Professor Bastel, and thank you everybody for having me on this webinar today. I'm really excited to be here. Resilinc is the industry leader in supply chain resiliency and risk management solutions. We provide our customers a set of comprehensive tools that include software, data, and services that help them quantify, monitor, and mitigate risks in their multi-tier supply chain. So our software is unique in that it provides visibility into the supply chains deep in, so not just restricted to the direct suppliers, but multiple tiers deep into the supply chain. We also provide customers with global 24/7 monitoring of supply chain disrupting events. So should something happen, should a disruption happen, our customers are notified right away and they get this very customized report that tells them what the impact is to their supply chains. Resilinc's been in the business for roughly 12 years now, and our specialization has always been supply chain resiliency and risk management. So we've been kind of doing it before, way before the pandemic started and all these supply chain disasters became, part of the public knowledge, so to say.
Sumit, thank you very much. So There are many ways how one can understand supply chain risk. Would you be so kind, please, and tell us a little bit, kind of, what's your take on it and what types of risk are our supply chains today exposed to?
Sure. So let me start with this old proverb, right? I'm sure everybody has seen this. For the want of a nail, the shoe was lost, and so on until the battle was lost. Right? If you actually think about it, right, this is one of the first renditions of a supply chain disaster. The battle was lost. Why? Because the knights were not able to fight. Why were the knights not able to fight? Well, they didn't have horses. What happened to the horses? It's not like they were sick. No, the horses weren't there because the farrier was not able to, fit shoes on the horses because he didn't have the required nails. So there was supply chain disruption all the way down at the level of the whoever was making the nails, and that caused a cascading impact that went all the way up to the kingdom, resulting in the loss of a battle. Right. So supply chain problems, supply chain disruptions have been with us for a very long time. And if you bring it into our modern world, right, what happens, right? A failure in supply chain in the multi-tier supply chain really ultimately it ends up in, no revenue, right? You've got a supplier disruption, your suppliers are not providing you with the materials you need, you're not making products, you're not keeping your customers happy, you're losing revenue, you're losing profits. The problem here is that these supply chain disruptions don't go away overnight. The impact doesn't go away overnight. The impact to your business doesn't go away in months. In many cases, we have seen that the impact lasts for several years. And that's because, as you can imagine, customers tend to move on, right? They don't get material from you. They'll try and find a different supplier to provide that part, material, product to them, right? So what happens now, you've lost customer loyalty. In many cases, we are seeing customers will set up long-term multi-year contracts with your competitors who have the material available. So now all of a sudden, it's not a few months of lost business for you, but it's a few years that you're out of that client or customer, right? You're effectively locked out until the duration of that contract. So that's why it is so critical, so vital for any OEM, for any manufacturer, that to develop this in-depth visibility into the supply chain, right? To understand what the risks are in the supply chain and not be limited just to the direct suppliers. You have to be looking deep into the suppliers, the supply chain. So your suppliers, their suppliers, so on and so forth. By developing that kind of visibility, you will be able to get a better sense of where the risks are and what you should be doing to address them, right? By the way, when I talk about risk, when I talk about supplier risk, company risk, it is not just sufficient to look at the traditional risk metrics like financial risk. Yeah, I know pretty much every company, when it onboards a supplier, they're going to look at the financials of that supplier. But again, that's no longer sufficient for supply chain resiliency. We're talking about taking this multidimensional view, this multidimensional look at every supplier, again, direct, and their suppliers and so on. So we're talking about things like natural disaster risk, geopolitical, macroeconomic risk, quality risk, capacity risk. Are these suppliers capable of supplying not just your steady state demand, but what if you have an upside, right? Business continuity risk, increasingly cybersecurity risk, environmental sustainability risks, and so on.
Sumit, thank you very much. But by now we we learned that understanding your supply chain is probably the first and one of the most critical parts or steps in building more resilient supply chains. Could you tell us, please, why is this the case and how do normally companies go about it? Sure.
So let me start by doing a recap of the last 2 years, right? Let's look at what has happened over the last 2 years first. So COVID, of course, COVID's been front and center for everybody. Disruptions because of COVID, that's where all of our attention and focus has been, right? We've also seen dramatic changes in consumption patterns. So you take all that together and you add in some really interesting phenomenon that we have been seeing around a dramatic increase in factory fires, chemical leaks, increasingly more active and disruptive hurricane and wildfire seasons. And we have the situation we find ourselves in today, right? We saw labor shortages, logistics bottlenecks, commodity shortages, and so on. It seemed like we were emerging out of the pandemic until the Omicron variant struck. And then all of a sudden, we went back into disruptions and lockdowns and so on. And as we started getting past that, Russia invaded Ukraine, and now we have a major crisis there. Obviously, the humanitarian toll that's taking it is unspeakable, and everything else pales in comparison to that. But again, the supply chain disruptions that's causing are also pretty massive. Let me draw your attention to the chart on the right-hand side here. This comes out of our EventWatch product, which does this 24/7 global event monitoring, right, of supply chain disruptions worldwide. What you will notice is from 2020 to 2021, there was an almost 200% increase in factory fires, right? They're almost doubled. Look at this other piece here, the supply shortages. They're shot up by almost 400%. Okay. We are attributing those factory fires, we are attributing a lot of these shortages to lockdowns and staff shortages, because of which safety measures have been ignored in factories. So think about that for a second, right? Because of lockdowns and such, there is a staff shortage. Factories are shut down. It's not just your staff that's not available. Auditors are not available. Inspectors are not available. There have been, compromises that have been made, and as a result, we are seeing increases in factory fires and supply shortages. Now, the unfortunate fact of the matter is that these disruptions are not likely to go away anytime soon. We expect that they're going to last well through 2022 and probably well into 23 as well. The war in Ukraine, that is also going to prolong the challenges we have with supply chain disruptions. Also, I want to make sure, I draw attention to the fact that COVID's not gone, right? As much as we would like to believe that, we're starting to see a surge, a rise in infections in parts of Europe and China as well. So it's entirely possible that there may be more disruptions coming because of the pandemic. It's also possible that new variants might emerge. And last thing about COVID, right, to keep in mind is that China still has a zero tolerance policy. They see a set of infections in a city, in a manufacturing hub, they shut the whole thing down, right? So we will continue to expect to see those kind of disruptions happen. Now, when we talk about these kind of disruptions, right, our immediate thought goes to, let me just stock up on inventory. Now my problem's gone. I have enough inventory, so then, I don't have to worry about shortages. I don't have to worry about my suppliers putting parts on allocation. Who cares? But that, my challenge to you, my assertion, that is a 20th century solution that we are trying to apply to modern problems. Okay. And look, let's admit it, right? As much as we would like to solve the problem with inventory, inventory is still a bad word in supply chain. So then if not inventory, what? Information, right? Knowledge is the way to solve, supply chain risk and resiliency problems. So let me talk about the kind of information we need in order to solve the problems more intelligently. Let's start with supply chain visibility, supply chain transparency. So this is all about understanding what your multi-tier supply chain looks like. And as I mentioned earlier, it is not just about focusing on your direct suppliers. You have to be looking at their suppliers and their suppliers and their suppliers and so on. In fact, we have one of our customers, an automotive OEM, they're mapping way down into tiers 4, 5, and so on, right? So let's start with that. So risk is a knowledge problem, as I said before, right? First and foremost. So getting that visibility into supply chains, deep into the supply chains is critical. And why is that? Well, our research shows that for most parts, companies have a pretty good handle on who their direct suppliers are, and in some cases also where those direct suppliers are doing their manufacturing. So the risk coming from those direct suppliers tends to be relatively low, 5 to 20%. But going just one tier deep, just one level deep into tier 2, look at the change there. The visibility drops dramatically to roughly 20%, and the risk jumps up to 20 to 50%. This, by the way, is risk that comes in from tier 2 and gets inherited by you as a manufacturer or the OEM. Go one tier deeper, tier 3 and deeper, and now the visibility is just practically not there. And look at how far the risk could go. As high as 90% of the risk comes in from tiers 3 and below. Right? Now, one of the things that I always get told is, well, all that is great, but we have this awesome multi-sourcing strategy. So we have a very diversified supply base. And so it's not going to matter if one supplier is disrupted, we are covered. But what we have seen is that is not generally the case, right? Even with companies that have done a terrific job with diversifying their direct supplier base, what they are not aware of is that because of the nature of supply chains, there are bottlenecks immediately at tier 2 itself, right? Supply chains, as you can imagine, are not a top-down hierarchy. They're really a mesh of connected companies. So what we see is that multiple tier 1 suppliers, multiple of your direct suppliers could be supplied by that same sub-tier supplier. So again, think about it like a diamond, right? There are all these multiple tier 1 suppliers you have a nice diversification going here, but this one single tier 2 supplier supplies to all of them. So this goes down, all of your tier 1 suppliers get impacted, right? So as much as we would like to depend on our multi-sourcing strategy, without knowing these single points of failures and these bottlenecks deeper in the supply chain, we're not having an effective multi-sourcing strategy, right? We're not having an effective protection against supply chain disruptions. So that is where the first knowledge requirement comes in. Understand your multi-tier supply chain. Don't restrict yourself to the direct suppliers only. Go as deep as you can. Collect information, not just on one dimension, like financial risk, but on multiple dimensions, as we had talked about earlier. This becomes the core, the foundation of the knowledge you need to implement a strong supply chain resiliency program. And then what you want to do is combine this with monitoring of worldwide supply chain disruptions. Okay, so as supply chains are spread out worldwide, then it becomes necessary for us to monitor news worldwide to make sure we can capture and understand which incident in which part of the world can impact manufacturing for our supply chains, right? I just wanted to highlight the kind of information you're looking for and the volume of information you need to collect by putting this slide up here. So what you're seeing in this slide is 1 week, just 1 week of supply chain affecting news that we've collected at Resilinc, right, as a part of our Event Watch solution. So if you look at this a slide, in 1 week, we captured over 200 different incidents that could impact supply chains. They go from anything from M&As and business sales to power outages to floods to cyber attacks and chemical spills and factory fires and so on. Now, one interesting and important thing that I have to mention here is that as you're collecting this news, as you're monitoring this news, you cannot afford to just focus on English language news from Western media outlets, right? A lot of these factory fires, those kind of incidents are only reported in the local press and the local languages. So you do want to get very comprehensive coverage worldwide in multiple languages from multiple sources, especially local sources. And last but not least, you also want to be monitoring social media. Again, not just in English, i.e. Facebook and Twitter, but also local language and regional social media networks, for example, Weibo in China. Right. So with the combination of these two kinds of information, you can make a good start on building out a resilient supply chain.
Sumit, thank you very much. So next question I have is, many companies approach analyzing their supply chain risk exposure through traditional procurement spend approach, which we all know is kind of like focusing on where do we spend the most money, right? Which are the biggest suppliers. Could you kind of shed some light on why that approach may not be the most useful or the most advised approach when it comes to analyzing risk, and what would be a better alternative?
Sure. So our traditional approach in supply chain has always been spend management, right? We love to apply the 80-20 rule. 80% of our spend is with 20% of these suppliers. So let's focus on those 20% of the suppliers. Let's get operational excellence from them. Let's make sure that we get the highest level of service and support from them. Problem is that does not work with risk. Now, as we saw with that proverb, right? Even the smallest little thing, even the smallest little component with a very tiny spend could bring down your entire supply chain. There are numerous examples of this, even very recently. For example, a $5 chip, right? A $5 chip brought down the auto industry. If you look at the costs of a car, $5 is a very small percentage of that, right? There are other examples like that, cardboard boxes costing pennies. Holding up a shipment of products where the costs of the products are in tens of dollars, right? So a part worth pennies, the cost of goods in tens of dollars, again bringing down manufacturing and shipping and ultimately revenue. So this is why the spend-based approach does not work. If you just focus on your 20% of the suppliers who you spend most money with, those suppliers who you don't spend a lot with, but have an outsized impact on your production, will likely bring your supply chains down, right? So the approach you really want to take is to look at all your suppliers, understand which products they are supplying to. I understand, the potential revenue impact should that supplier be disrupted to you. And then you also want to understand the risks associated with that those suppliers, right? So basically what you're doing is taking a brand new approach that's not spend-based, but rather looks at the risk and revenue at risk related with every supplier. And then you take action based on which suppliers have the highest possible potential of bringing your revenue down, of impacting your manufacturing.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Sumit. So implementing a systematic approach to managing supply chain risk can be quite a daunting task for many companies for a variety of reasons. But would you be able to tell us a little bit how could actually companies start with that?
Sure. So we get asked this question quite often, right? Well, the pandemic has already started. We are right in the middle of all these disruptions, or the war between Russia and Ukraine is already in progress. It's 4 weeks in. There are all these supply chain disruptions that are already happening. Are we too late? Or we hear, well, supply chain resiliency sounds like this big, a daunting project. Should we even be considering it, or should we just buy inventory? Right. So we talked about inventory. I won't, talk about it again. But our answer is always this, right? That supply chain resiliency is a journey. It is not something that happens overnight, right? It is not something where you can flip a switch and overnight you're resilient. No, it is absolutely a journey. And like with any journey, you have to start somewhere, because if you don't, then there is no journey happening. What we have seen with many, many companies at this point, right, over the last 12 years of our operations, is that companies either come in with an existing risk practice and they are trying to enhance it, or companies are starting new, or they're somewhere in the middle there, right? But if it feels very daunting, start small, right? Identify those suppliers. Of all your thousands of suppliers, maybe identify that small set that has the most revenue impacting potential, and start there. So start small, start with putting a process in place, putting people in place, training the people, starting to build out playbooks, starting to build out tabletop exercises, starting to build out data, starting to bring in the software and tools. Please don't do this with spreadsheets and email, right? There are tools available now that can help you. So start building those things out. What we have seen is training the people, putting processes in place, institutionalizing risk practices. That is what the process is about. And then, of course, the intelligence with the data, the software, and so on comes in along the way. So again, my summary would be: it's never too late. It's a journey. Start today, and over time, in a couple of years, your company, your supply chain will definitely be resilient, far more resilient than it may be today.
Sumit, thank you very much. Could you expand a little bit, and as part of designing this systematic approach to supply chain risk management, what should companies be actually doing as part of the journey?
Okay, sure. So at Resilinc, we recommend taking a two-prong approach, that is the reactive approach, and alongside that, the proactive approach. So the reactive approach is all about doing this global 24/7 event monitoring, right? So you've developed the ability to detect supply chain disruptions quickly. Okay. Once you have the ability to detect supply chain disruptions quickly, you want to be able to also quickly understand the impact to you. Right? What is the impact to you, your supply chain, your products? And you want to be able to also get information directly from the suppliers quickly. A disruption has happened. Maybe there's a flood. That doesn't mean that you are impacted. Even if that supplier's factory is flooded, doesn't mean you may be impacted, right? So getting that exact information from the supplier. This disruption has happened. What is the impact to me? How long is the impact? Those three things together, right? The ability to detect, the ability to understand what the impact of the disruption is to you, and the ability to collect information from the suppliers. That's the reactive piece. That's the first workflow that we recommend that you implement, so that you're now able to start responding and reacting to supply chain disruptions. The second workflow that we recommend that companies implement is the proactive piece. So this is where you're prepared ahead of time. You're made your supply chain more resilient. So when a shock actually happens, when a disruption actually happens, the impact to you is minimized, right? And the way to go about this is to start by creating that visibility in your supply chain. So we're talking about mapping out parts, sub-tiers, business continuity, cybersecurity, social responsibility, and so on. So again, mapping out risks across multiple different dimensions deep into your supply chain. Once you have that information in place, you should be building analytics that give you immediate visibility into where the risks are, where the bottlenecks are, where the single points of failure are. Then again, using analytics and using scorecard technology, kind of functionality, benchmarking, you should be able to create a grouping of suppliers. Right now, we're getting into the prioritization phase. Of all your thousands of suppliers, which ones do you act on first? So using, again, scorecarding, benchmarking, and actions like that, you can prioritize which suppliers to act on, and then you can execute various different playbooks in order to mitigate those risks. Mitigations come in a variety of different formats depending on your business needs. It could be anything from finding an alternate supplier or working with an existing supplier so they can provide additional manufacturing in a different region, i.e., you qualify additional sites for your manufacturing, to even taking the design for resiliency approach, where as you are designing a new product, you're building in resiliency. So high-risk components are accounted for at the time of design. Okay, so with that proactive workflow in place, then again, you're hardening your supply chain ahead of time. So should something happen in the future, your exposure is minimized. So to summarize, then what we recommend is companies take this two-prong approach: the reactive approach to do the worldwide monitoring and rapid response, and the proactive approach to prepare ahead of time and mitigate risks ahead of time.
Thank you very much for this. Given that deep insight that you have in global supply chain risk exposure, what's your your outlook on the next 12 to 18 months?
Okay, let me talk about that. So as I was mentioning earlier, right, as we look through 2022 and beyond into 2023, we do expect to see these supply chain challenges continue. We do expect to see them persist. Specifically, the semiconductor shortage, I don't think that's going away anytime soon. That situation is going to persist, and some pretty significant changes will be needed, which I'll talk about shortly, to over a longer period of time mitigate those issues. Let me talk about a few specific things, starting with the global energy crisis. It's very easy to lose a track of the fact that, yes, there is a global energy crisis that's been going on. The pandemic and now the Russia-Ukraine war have kind of put that out of people's minds, but it is very much an ongoing problem. For example, China has been facing significant challenges with its energy supplies. That situation is not resolving itself anytime soon. If anything, the war in Ukraine is going to make the situation worse for China. Another big area that companies will need to start focusing on is are regulations that are either implemented or are in the process of being implemented around environmental, social, and governance, or ESG factors. Okay, you can see, several different countries actively looking at this, and again, some of the regulations are already in place, and others are coming quickly. So every supply chain and every industry is going to have to prepare for this, else face the prospects of fines and disruptions. Our strong recommendation would be that you start reviewing these regulations and planning for compliance, including audits, both for your own company and for your suppliers. We also expect to see increased and continued volatility in commodity prices. Okay, again, these are driven by a number of different factors, things like increased consumption of electronics driven by consumers, electric vehicles. Some of those things combined, with the war that's going on, means that the demand for critical rare earth elements and critical materials is going up, continues to go up, but the supply is not keeping up. And this, especially with rare earth elements, it's one of those things where it's not easy to ramp up production. Production ramp up doesn't happen quickly. So it's going to be taking time before we get there. And so we can continue to expect to see commodity price volatility. Okay. Now, one of the bigger trends that we see, and this is really worth talking about and considering, is the reorganization of supply chains more regionally. The pandemic made it really, really clear that there is a big role to be played for more localized, more regional supply chains to reduce the possibility of disruptions and to reduce, all these log jams we have at shipping ports and such. Here are some examples where this is already starting to happen. We have already heard about a few semiconductor investments, right, wafer fabrication and such in the US and Europe. 2 years ago, this would be unthinkable. You would not have even have considered or thought that these large electronics manufacturers would be putting operations in the US or Europe, but it's happening now, right? we're going to see many more of these investments happen, not just in the US and Europe in Europe, but across the world. The Pan-American supply chain has been talked about, and we will start seeing progress made on that over the next few years as well. Finally, expect to see many more disruptions because of cybersecurity attacks. Okay, cybersecurity incidents are continuing to go up. They will continue to go up, and increasingly, we're going to see manufacturing infrastructure. So the shop floors, if you may, the warehouses, the transportation hubs, those will be increasingly becoming targets for cybersecurity attacks. One of the primary reasons there is because the infrastructure happens to be very old, not very secure, and that makes them very attractive targets for hackers. So expect to see that, expect to see those go up, and expect to see disruptions to your supply chains because your suppliers maybe got hit by ransomware attacks. Okay, we believe that the lessons learned from the pandemic will not be forgotten very soon. That, I think, is the good news here, if there is any, right? It is going to encourage companies to redesign their supply chains, but this time keeping resiliency in mind. What I would say is this, right? The landscape in supply chain is changing. We're starting to see supply chain organizations abandon their 20th century thinking and tools. I'm talking spreadsheets and emails as well here, right? In favor of modern approaches and modern technologies to solving today's problems. So we're increasingly seeing things like artificial intelligence being brought in to solve supply chain problems. Hyper automation. This is another one that is really exciting to automate all the mundane work that supply chains tend to do, so organizations can focus more on the strategics. Right? I firmly believe how we do business is going to be transformed over the next few years. There has never been a more exciting time to be in supply chain.
Sumit, thank you very much. This was extremely insightful and a lot of useful information, a lot of food for thought. We still have a little bit of time and we have a couple of questions over here. If you don't mind, I'll just go from the first one to the last one. So we have one person from the audience is asking, what is the best way to determine if your supplier is actually impacted by risk item in brackets versus using it as an excuse to raise costs?
Yeah, so, again, this starts with developing a good insight into what your risks are, right? What your supplier's risks are. The way we do it at Resilinc is by collecting information directly from the suppliers. Right, so let's take business continuity as an example. I bring this up as an example because we see this quite often. Yeah, we have generators to provide backup power, but they're not testing those generators. Yeah, we are testing the generators, but they don't have diesel stocked up. So if they need to run the generators, they can actually run them. So they have business continuity plans in place, but when you actually dig deeper, all these problems start showing up. So going directly to the supplier, collecting that data, and then understanding that, yeah, this risk is real with that supplier, but not with that other supplier, is a good starting point to see what is real and what is not real.
Thank you, Sumit. This is a little bit more, the next question is a little bit more high level, and it goes like this. To what extent are companies not understanding supply chain dynamics in their attempts to create resilience?
So the way I would answer that question is different companies are at different maturity levels when it comes to thinking about risk and addressing risk. Certainly, if you look at just our customer base, we have companies who have been doing supply chain risk for many, many years now. They have this well-built practice. They have processes, people ingrained into their organizations to a point where senior executives can move in and out. The frontline people can move in and out. Doesn't matter. Those risk practices remain because it's embedded in the DNA of the organization. Right. And then at the other extreme, we have companies coming in now who are just starting to understand that they need to harden their supply chains against disruptions. And so they are coming in trying to learn. Right. So it's a gamut. There is always going to be a starting point. And for those companies, as they start collecting data, as they start working through risks, they start learning more and more. Their organization starts learning more, and slowly they develop more understanding and cognition of risk.
Thank you, Sumit. So the next question goes like this. Much of what has been happening over the last 2 years regarding all suppliers, direct or tier 2, 3, have been unplanned constraints. How do you think about planning for the unknown impact on the supply chain, for example, like Russia-Ukraine crisis or expanded power outages in Asia?
Yeah, so I think we know this, right? It is impossible to eliminate risk, right? You cannot ever eliminate risk. You can only take steps to mitigate risk. Mm-hmm. So once you have that understanding of what your risks are in your supply chain, like geopolitical risk, for example, let's take that. That situation between Russia and Ukraine, the geopolitical risk in that region has always been very high. I mean, you can go back to the annexation of Crimea, and you can even point to that and earlier to see that that region has very high geopolitical risk. Mm-hmm. So having that understanding ahead of time should allow you to start planning for contingencies. So should something happen to my supplier in that region, if I have an alternate supplier qualified, let's say in Germany, then maybe I can start sourcing from there when there is a problem here. What we see are some of our customers do once they have some of this data and insight built out is they start running simulations. So they will run what if exercises. What if this happens in the something happens in this region? So maybe they can model something like conflict in Russia and its neighborhood, right? Maybe they can model lockdowns in Shenzhen in China, right? And we see customers do that. And with those simulations now, they get these answers coming back ahead of time that should a lockdown happen in Shenzhen, here is what could happen to your manufacturing. So maybe it's time to qualify that site in Chengdu as well, so you can fall over to the manufacturer there or the site there. So those kind of simulations, those kind of exercises become very essential to planning for the unknown.
Thank you very much, Sumit. Next question goes like, can you speak to tools that you use for human rights due diligence in risk assessment? Do you find that US State Department's annual trafficking in persons report helpful? Do you consider the UN guiding principles on human rights and business as an important lens for risk assessment?
Yeah, so when it comes to human rights, there are a few different things we want to look at. Certainly, these reports are a good starting point, but we need to do more. Mm-hmm. Okay, and it comes to a few factors. It really comes back to your multi-tier supply chain mapping. First and foremost, you need to know who these companies are. If you don't even know who your supplier is or your sub-tier supplier is, if you don't know that your supplier, your direct supplier is subcontracting to somebody, and that somebody is located in a region that is known for human rights violations, what can you do, right? So build that insight first, then go directly to your suppliers and collect this information from them. Then you can overlay, okay, these regions are known for employing child labor, for instance, right? Or for employing slave labor. Overlay, here are company names. Maybe there are NGOs that are publishing company names. They do this frequently, right? These are the companies that have been known for human rights violations. Overlay that. Overlay, companies that the U.S. government and the EU and other countries sanction. Now you're starting to build out a picture of, where your risks related to human rights violations lay.
Thank you very much. So another question goes, you mentioned redesign of supply chains to be more regional, in brackets, high shipping costs / port congestion resilience. Price elasticity of products has to play a major part in that. Any thoughts on how to predict / test price elasticity on products, as well as competitor behavior with pricing?
So let me answer that a little differently for a second, right? The regionalization, the localization of supply chains, it's going to take time. As we all know, it's going to be impossible to, let's say China, right? To pick a certain manufacturing from China and just dump it here. We don't have, trained people. We don't have the infrastructure, the equipment, et cetera, necessary to make it happen overnight. But it will happen, but not everything is going to come back, and that's where this trade-off comes in, right? What makes sense to have regional versus to have, where it is happening today? It comes down to price. It comes down to cost. Is the cost of shipping from China, let's say, and the expected loss you could face should there be a shipping disruption, should there be a disruption that far out, is that cost higher or lower than, let's say, situating manufacturing in Honduras, right? Those are the trade-offs. Those are the calculations that will have to be made in order to make an intelligent decision on where to source from the local or regional manufacturer or supplier, or continue to go overseas.
Thank you, Sumit. So the next question is a little bit more specific, and it goes, can you expand on how many tier 1 to tier 3 suppliers have had to close due to bullwhip effect from COVID? Do you think this will continue over the next years from COVID-Ukraine war?
So I don't actually know numbers off the top of my head, so I couldn't tell you that, X hundred suppliers at tier 2 or tier 3 shut down because of the bullwhip effect. What I can tell you, and to answer, the question about the war, certainly any kind of a big shock like that is going to cause a problem in the supply chain. What we are seeing, to specifically answer the issue with the bullwhip effect, right? What we are seeing is companies have started going into this panic mode, right? Oh my gosh, we've had this yet another disruption. Let's just hoard as much inventory as we can get our hands on. Let's over project our demand. But all businesses are cyclical, and there is going to be coming a time where, well, before I go there, let's finish this, right? So they're all over projecting their demand, and that consolidated over projection is definitely going down into the supply chain, causing these major ripples further upstream, right? It is definitely happening, and the Russia-Ukraine war is absolutely contributing to it. What is likely to happen, though, is over the next few years, we may see things flip, right? As demand starts stabilizing, as situations start improving, companies might end up stocking too much, right? So, there is this big artificial demand being pushed down, and that is causing distress definitely at the tier 2, 3, 4, 5, and further levels. The flip is also coming down.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Sumit. Continuing from that, will the ability of having multiple suppliers naturally decrease due to the COVID issues and Ukrainian issues and cause more monopolies throughout the businesses?
So the way I would answer that is, traditional economics are going to come into play here. If there is money to be made in a certain business, you will definitely see multiple companies there, right? That's just how economics work. So In the short term, yeah, maybe because of supply chain pressures and disruptions, a few suppliers may go out of business, and there may be consolidation also that will happen. But if something is lucrative, others will enter into that same market.
Thank you, Sumit. About 2 years ago, when COVID pandemic hit and companies started realizing how exposed they are and how fragile our supply chain system actually is, one of the strategies that surfaced and picked up quite a lot of attention was the model of China plus N, meaning which is part of that supply diversification strategy. Now, in last 2 years, a lot has changed when it comes to the geopolitical dynamic between the United States and China. And I'm wondering, do you have any views on how viable that strategy is today, and how far have companies come in implementing it?
Yeah, so, putting politics aside, right? China and America, China and the EU, right? China and Japan, there are such strong business relations here, right? None of those entities are going to be able to do things on their own. And those dependencies are not going away anytime soon. Some things are easy to put up quickly in a different location, but many things are not. This dependency on China is there, it's going to remain, but we're going to see other regions starting to come up where quite a bit of redundancy from China is going to start becoming available. It will vary by industry for sure. If it's something simple to make, if it's something easy to make, requires lower infrastructure, and it has fewer infrastructure barriers, those are the kind of things we're going to see go outside of China sooner compared to the more complex operations. But again, what I would say is, putting politics aside, these supply chains are so tightly intertwined, the US, the EU, Japan, China, etc. It's not going to be possible to disentangle them within 1 or 2 years.
Sumit, thank you very much. We have kind of reached at the end of the open questions. Is there anything else you would like to add as a summary before the rest of the announcement and the closure?
I would just say, start thinking about, how you are going to evolve your supply chains, right? Your competitors are not sitting still. If you are still seeing, and by the way, this comment is not just for supply chain risk, right? If you're seeing your organization continue to use the spreadsheets and emails, continue to do things manually to run your supply chains, there's something that you need to look at urgently, right? There is a strong push towards digitalization in the supply chain, bringing in AI, bringing in big data technologies, really bringing in tooling to help supply chains become more efficient. And if you're not looking at it, you are going to get left behind. So that's one thing I would strongly recommend that every organization start looking at. How do you bring your supply chains into the 21st century?
Sumit, thank you very much. This was extremely insightful, very useful, a lot of great advice here during this good 45-50 minutes that we had together. I want to thank you from my end, and of course in the name of our audience as well. I have a couple of more short announcements over here before we close this webinar, and I'll share my screen with everyone. Let me just do this like this. Okay, I hope you can see this, right? So the first thing that I would say, Sumit closed this, I would say, like official part of our conversation with the future trends. We're gonna expand on that when it comes to, particularly when it comes to the future of supply chain risk management, with a little bit more emphasis on cybersecurity. And so we have in 2 weeks another session which is titled the future of supply chain risk, cyber resilience in the supply chain, where Sumit will again be one of the panel members together with Richard Sharpie, CEO of Competitive Advantage, and Dean Sable, who's the Director of Cybersecurity for GE Healthcare. So please register for that part as well. It's going to be really interesting and a nice expansion on what we have been talking today. Then we also have a part 3, which we're going to run on April 21st. And in this part, we are actually taking a look into a part of the supply chain that very often gets forgotten, both from teaching and talking about it, but it has a dramatic impact on when it comes to the either improving or actually decreasing one's supply chain resilience. Namely, this is the role of the small and medium-sized companies, which any big company has a multitude of them, maybe not always in the first tier, but definitely in the second, third, and fourth tier of their supply networks. So we're going to have 3 interesting panelists over here. We're going to have Annie Williams. She's a supply chain director, retired, of North America Home Care for SC Johnson. We're going to have Christina Ryan. She's Executive Vice President of Managed Services at Redwood Logistics. And we have Phil Weir, who's a Vice President of Sales for SAP America. So feel free, please, to register as well. Another great panel, and I'm looking forward to welcome all of you back. And again, let me close this by really thanking our sponsors who are actually supporting the organization of this symposium. Our platinum sponsors are Uline, Direct Supply, and Milwaukee Tool. And our gold sponsors are Redwood Logistics and GE Healthcare. Silver sponsor is Kohler, and we have a blue sponsors, Plexus and UPS. So on that note, I will close this webinar. I would like to thank all of you for participating, for asking questions, but particularly you, Sumit, for your kindness, for sharing your knowledge and your wisdom, and looking forward to welcome all of you again in 2 weeks. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.